Me, AJ, went
AJ,
to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Happening.
Where was the cemetery?
The cemetery?
In Guatemala, right? The cemetery was in Guatemala.
Guatemala.
What is the Day of the Dead?
Of the dead. Of the dead.
A holiday, right? The Day of the Dead is a holiday. When is the Day of the Dead?
A holiday. November 1st.
November 1st. The Day of the Dead.
The Day of the Dead.
Was and is November 1st.
November 1st.
Okay. So I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead to see what was happening. What I found was quite interesting. Was it boring? No, it wasn't boring.
It wasn't.
Was it
boring.
interesting?
Interesting.
Yes, it was interesting. The cemetery was interesting. How did I feel about the cemetery? I felt it was interesting. Or I thought it was interesting. Was it boring or was it interesting? It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting? The cemetery. The cemetery was interesting. When was the cemetery interesting? It was interesting on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Okay, the atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party. Was the atmosphere very sad? No, the atmosphere was not sad. The atmosphere was like a party. The atmosphere was very happy. Was the atmosphere sad or happy? The atmosphere was happy. The atmosphere was like a party. What was like a party? The atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party. Where was the atmosphere like a party? In the cemetery, right? The cemetery. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. Was the atmosphere like a party at my house? No, not at my house. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. The atmosphere was not like a party in my house. So the atmosphere was like a party. There were people everywhere. Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Where were the families sitting? Around the graves, right? They were sitting around the graves. Who was sitting around the graves? The families, right? The families were sitting around the graves. Were they sitting around the trees? No, they weren't sitting around the trees.
They were sitting around.
They were sitting around the graves.
They were sitting around the graves.
So, where were they sitting?
Where were they sitting?
Around the graves.
Around the graves.
Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors? Yes, yes, they were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their friends? No, not really. They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Who was sitting around the graves? That's right, families were sitting around the graves. Whose graves were they sitting around? Whose graves were they sitting around? Yes, their dead ancestors. Their ancestors.
Your ancestors.
Their ancestors' graves. They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors.
The dead ancestors.
Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors or the graves of their friends? Ancestors, right? They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. They cleaned the graves and added fresh flowers. Okay, who cleaned the graves?
Who cleaned the graves?
That's right, the families.
The family.
What did they add?
What did they add?
They added fresh flowers.
Fresh flowers.
Did they add food?
Food.
No, they didn't add food.
They didn't add.
Did they add money?
Money.
No, they didn't add money. They added fresh flowers.